Lecture 15, Other Three-Dimensional Media. Here is a list of terms for today's discussion on other three-dimensional media. This again is a skeleton for your note-taking as we move through this discussion. We did a discussion on sculpture. Lecture 14 was on sculpture. Lecture 15 is kind of an addendum to sculpture, and for whatever reason, the author of the textbook that we've been reading, Sayers, A World of Art, makes a distinction between sculpture and craft. And let's have a discussion about what is craft and what is fine art, or what is craft as fine art. The line between the arts and the crafts is a very fine line, and it's a difficult line. Craft usually refers to expert handiwork for object making. Yet artists produce works by hand and don't call their artwork craft. So again, we have this distinction and this division and this kind of oppositional relationship between fine art and craft. One way to separate art from craft is to suggest that works or objects made for aesthetic purposes can be art, and works made for functional purposes are craft. And that is by and large the universal argument that if it has a function or a purpose, it can be craft, and if it's just sitting there as an aesthetic object for our aesthetic consideration, then it must be art. But that distinction doesn't work either. It's not that easy. Artists have blurred those lines, as you've seen and will see in this discussion. Anyway, perhaps it's irrelevant what the distinction between the arts and the crafts are, but it is an area of conflict and argument amongst artists and craftsmen, craft people, men and women. I would say that one clear distinction between the arts and the crafts could be that if you are an art maker, an object maker, and you work with one specific medium and you never vary, and you are in fact a master of that one specific medium, then perhaps you are a craftsman working within the language of that medium. Although that doesn't hold. So, for example, if you work with porcelain only, you're probably a craftsman, a ceramicist. But painters work with oil paint only, and we don't call them craftsmen. So suffice to say that it's a difficult argument. What's the difference between arts and crafts? What are crafts? What are crafts as fine art? The larger historical argument has been that if it has a utilitarian function, like if it's a bowl that holds food, or if it's a vessel that holds water, or if you're a metalsmith and you're making spoons or silverware, or a jeweler making ornamental bracelets and rings and earrings, then you're a craftsman or craftsperson. To get to the notion of craft as fine art, really what we need is, I think, an object that among its attributes also includes some kind of aesthetic, poetic purpose. Anyway, so you've got the general argument, and then you've got the kind of subtleties of why they don't really hold water. So let's talk about craft. We'll start with the craft media of ceramics. This lecture will go through ceramics, glass blowing, metal wood weaving, tapestry and embroidery, as well as some other three-dimensional media. So, first we have ceramics, and ceramics are objects that are formed from clay and hardened by firing in a kiln. Kiln is spelled K-I-L-N, and most people don't pronounce the N, they just say kill. There's kind of a soft N there, kiln. Usually ceramic objects are flat and relief-like, or hollow like cast sculpture. Some ceramic objects are slip cast, meaning the clay is liquidized and poured into a plaster form, where it is set up, dries, and is fired, but most ceramic objects are made by one of three methods. And those three methods for making things out of clay, for making ceramics, are slab construction, coiling, or throwing. And throwing is done on a potter's wheel. pieces are also glazed later on. This is a piece of blue jasper ware, piece of wedgwood. This stuff's still available in a uh, very carefully monitored and highly skilled factory production. But this is some of the original 1786 Joshua Wedgwood design Wedgwood ceramics. The piece we saw a moment ago was very exclusive and very carefully and handmade. Um, this next set of also of Wedgwood stuff made in the 1850s, 70 years later, is a more useful ware. It's something that's more mass-produced and more available to the general public. However, we all live in a world with ceramics. I'm not certain, but I think it's fair to say that we all have ceramic dishes and bowls in our homes. They're made of clay, which is fired in a kiln. Um, the more the more ornamental and the more carefully labored the each dish is, each bowl, dish, and saucer are, the more expensive and valuable they'll be. Here's another Wedgwood bowl, again, that has some relief sculpture inlaid on the side. So, back to ceramics. You've got clay that's fired in a kiln until it becomes ceramic. And most ceramics are constructed, I mentioned, with slab construction, coil construction, or throwing on a potter's wheel. All ceramics are glazed. Well, not all, but if you want to make a piece of clay waterproof, you have to glaze it. Um, first, we see the tea bowl by Amagumo, or tea bowl named Amagumo by Kotsu, a a Japanese ceramicist from the early 17th century, and this is an example of a slab constructed vessel. The clay is rolled out flat, kind of like a pie crust. You cut a shape, then you shape it by hand and kind of pinch the clay bits together until you get this device. This piece is fired in one of the 6 ancient kilns, which are these traditional wood-fired ceramic kilns in Japan, known as the Anagama, and they dug narrow tunnels and had fluted chimneys out the back of the hill, and they were pit-fired in a way that gave the ceramics that came out of it a very random and unpredictable finish. So you get this kind of charred kind of bowl here that is perhaps very beautiful, but its beauty was uncontrolled, and no one could be certain of what would come out of the kiln. Slab construction. Next, we have this jar, which is made in the 1940s, and this is coil built, meaning that snakes, kind of snakes of clay, would be rolled out between the hands, and then they'd be laid in form and then smoothed out in between. So we had slab construction, and now we have the coiling technique. Uh, Again, long snake-like shapes or strands of clay would be coiled and stacked around one another, and then they'd be smoothed together um, to get the overall hollow pot. You need all your vessels to be hollow for a couple of reasons. One, clay can't be fired solid because it'll have too much moisture on the inside, and that moisture will turn to steam and blow up. But two, pretty much universally, all clay vessels have to hold water or grain or something. They evolved and they were invented to be places to store food and water and drink. So it's got to be hollow. The third method after slab construction and coil construction is throwing. Throwing is done on a potter's wheel. We see 3 images that show us clay being thrown on a wheel. Um, this image was made very famous in the film Ghost, where Demi Moore and Patrick Swayze, I think, and Whoopi Goldberg had that weird moment with somebody was dead and somebody helped to make a pot. Anyway, for this, you literally you kind of throw a blob of clay onto a slow spinning disc, and then you kind of lean in and pinch it, and you hollow the form out and make the pot. It's a lot of fun, and it requires a great deal of skill to make it expertly, but not much skill to make kind of an awkward kind of bowl. So if you ever get an opportunity to throw a pot, it's a lot of fun. You probably won't get expert results your first time, but you will get something, and that's kind of worth experiencing. So again, this is the third method of making ceramics, which is throwing. Here's Greek a Greek vessel, um, an amphora vessel, which has this wonderful contour drawing on the outside of it, usually of Greek mythologies. The Greeks would store their wine and serve their wine. They wouldn't store, I'm sorry. They would serve their wine for parties in these wonderful pots. And to keep their parties going for hours and hours, they had a tradition where they would serve, for the beginning of the party, they would serve you full strength wine. And then as the party would go on a few hours later, they would start adding water to the wine to dilute it. And then till the end of the evening, when you're drinking, 90% water with just 1/10 wine, and this was done in an effort to keep their guests from getting too drunk, so you could keep the party going longer. Greeks were big partiers, of course, but they used these fanciful vessels to dilute and serve their wine. Their wine wasn't that good. They had retsina, which is kind of a wine made from pine needles. It's kind of awful, but it's still made very bitter. So I guess cutting it with water is a good idea. Anyway, there are three basic types of ceramics. We spoke about three different ways to fabricate vessels. Now we'll talk about three different basic types of clay, and those are earthenware, stoneware, and porcelain. Um, Earthenware is what we see here, and earthenware has to be glazed to be waterproof. Terracotta, the kind of stuff that you see, those simple brown flower pots that are so inexpensive but so fragile, well, that's unglazed terracotta. This is glazed terracotta. Once you put a glaze on it, it can become waterproof. Next, you have well, you would have terracotta first, then you would have earthenware. I don't have an image of earthenware. And then finally, you have porcelain. Porcelain is the finest ceramic. Porcelain is what your toilet's made out of, and your sinks in your bathroom. Porcelain is a clay body so fine that it is waterproof without glazing, and it can be nearly. It's fired to a very high temperature, and it's nearly transparent. You don't think about it much, but your toilets in your home are made out of fired ceramic. It's made of porcelain, which is a kind of clay that's fired to such a high temperature it's nearly glass. It nearly vitrifies and turns to glass, but it's not. It's still a clay body. Um, During the Qing dynasty in China, true porcelain was made and perfected, and the official kilns at Qing Ti Chuan became a huge industrial export center, and a lot of the, again, what we called your fine china was this superior ceramics that came out of this region in the 14th to 17th century in China. Um, and export and trade flourished for various dynasties um, because of the exceptional quality of work in this porcelain. Um, it was called the family Verte vase, Verte Latin or Italian for green, because of the distinctive greens used in the decoration. So the title, the Verte uh, family Verte, was because of the greenness in the piece. But porcelain again is a clay body that's very high in its grain, and it's impervious to water. I'll repeat the three different clay bodies. Earthenware is a porous clay fired at a low temperature, and it must be glazed to hold water. Stoneware is impenetrable to water because it's fired at a higher temperature. And then beyond stoneware is porcelain, which is fired at the highest temperature until it becomes almost translucent, like glass, but it's not quite glass. Again, as I mentioned, the first true porcelain is made in China, which is why we say that our best dishes are the good china. So For Thanksgiving, you might take out the good china to serve dinner because you're using your best porcelain dishes. Well, that name came from the fact that porcelain was perfected and produced uh, hundreds of years ago in China. So we call it the best dishes, the good china. Um, Back to that argument between arts and crafts and fine art and fine craft. Well, Betty Woodman has made this floral vase and shadow, and obviously the vase might hold water, but the shadow behind it, which is also made of clay and is dimensional, is talking about something else, something aesthetic. There's no functional capacity to that shadow. That shadow won't hold flowers or hold water. So here we see an artist who's kind of redefining the utilitarian purpose of ceramics and making it more aesthetic. Also, those beautifully fancy kind of handles or scroll, kind of ribbony handles on the side of this blue and yellow vase are very beautiful but very impractically fragile. Nonetheless, that shadow is a great example of how this piece is rooted both in craft but also rooted in fine art because the shadow serves no purpose other than an aesthetic purpose. Ceramic is not just for vessels. Here you see a beautiful mosaic attached to a fence outside this home. It's glazed ceramic tiles, and it creates a very beautiful wall in the garden. You can make gigantic mosaic patterns from little, smaller tiles, which can be made again out of stoneware or porcelain, and then they can be painted on with different glazes and fired, and then assembled to make this beautiful and very complicated mural. So it's kind of a mosaic mural, we would call this, made of glazed ceramic tiles. Surely this piece incorporates craft and fine art to the point of it being really an aesthetic experience. However, there's still got to be lots of expertise in the area of ceramics. Next, after ceramics, we'll talk about glass. Um, Glass is an ancient media made by heating silica or sand until it melts and can be formed. The invention of glass blowing was late in the first century BC, and it became a big industry in Rome by the Roman Empire. In Venice, Venetian glass is still made, and this piece is not blown glass. This is a mosaic glass bowl, which was produced near Rome during the second half of the first century BC. Before glass blowing really took hold, to make this shape, you would have fused bits of colored glass into a ceramic form by putting it in a kiln under a controlled heat and slumping the glass. Believe it or not, you can you can kind of you can kind of semi-melt glass or slump it, get it to kind of bend and melt together, kind of like taffy. Perhaps you've been at a campfire in your life and you've thrown a bottle of wine or beer or something into the campfire, but not during the roaring fire. If you were to throw a bottle into a fire when the ashes and embers are still real soft, when the fire is down and just the ashes and embers are glowing, if you were to kind of bury a bottle within those embers, well, the glass will heat up and melt because it's got all that heat there. Once you get over 2,000 degrees, the glass starts to melt. But the big problem with reshaping and slumping glass is the cooling process or the annealing process. So you can melt glass pretty easily, just give it lots of heat. But as it cools and goes from liquid back to solid form, it'll crack at around 7 to 900 degrees unless you have a very kind of a slow cooling process, very slow. Depending on how thick the glass is, it's got to be a real slow cooling process. So what they learned in ancient Rome was how to control the fires and slowly anneal the glass or cool the glass from its liquid state to its solid state to keep it from cracking. This piece is not blown glass, but rather it's slumped glass, where you put bits of pre-existing colored glass and have them melt into a refractory or plaster form. But it's very old. It's over 2,000 years old, and it's a pretty beautiful pattern on there as well. Um, there's a little works in progress section in your book on Dale Chihuly. I'm sorry, Peter Volkus. First, Peter Volkus. Peter Volkus is an old time abstract expressionist artist who works non-objectively, and we spoke about Jackson Pollock, the painter, and we spoke about David Smith, the sculptor. And here's Peter Volkas, and he's kind of the ceramic artist equivalent to those two artists in that he works non-objectively, kind of defying the tradition of ceramics, and makes these gigantic and highly expressive ceramic vessels, but they don't hold water. In fact, they've got holes in them. Anyway, here's a one two-dimensional work of his, where you see his kind of expressive mark-making style. And now we'll cut to a ceramic piece. Oh, here's another collage where he's making a study for one of his vessels. Um, and he's Peter Volkas is an artist who's been real involved in kind of Zen practice, and a lot of ceramicists are involved in kind of Zen philosophy because you've got the kind of primordial notion of earth, water to make the clay, earth and water make the clay, and then fire to fuse it and to fire the clay to make it permanent, turn it to ceramic. So earth, water, and fire, even wind used to bring oxygen to the flames to make them grow. So lots of ceramic artists kind of have this kind of Zen philosophy about earth, wind, and fire. Earth, wind, water, and fire, the four primordial elements. And that lends to a kind of a Zen philosophy about the universe and the forces of nature. Anyway, Peter Volkas embraces these things in his work, and I'll show you one of his non-functional ceramic vessels. Here's a piece by, it's actually mislabeled. This is by Peter Volkas. It's called X-Neck, so ignore the title on the bottom. But this is a work of wood-fired stoneware that's about 3 feet tall by Peter Volkas. Again, one of the first artists to have the courage to take away the functional needs of ceramics. So he's got holes in this piece. It would never hold water. It would never hold flowers. It's kind of this beautiful mess, this beautiful organic kind of vessel that looks like it's ancient, perhaps. Looks like it's been on fire. Looks like it's been through a flood. His pieces are, again, motivated by his Zen philosophy and by the materials and the forces of nature that a ceramic artist uses when they make their work, those being earth and water to make the clay, and then wind and fire to literally bake the clay and turn it into ceramics. It's a pretty nice piece. It's not traditionally beautiful, and certainly it's not functional in that you can't do anything with it. So here's again a work of art by Peter Volkas that translates from craft into just pure art or fine art, because it has no function. Strangely enough, we're jumping backwards from because we talked about glass a moment ago. I'm not sure why your textbook jumps from glass to ceramics, but we just did. Let's go back to glass. Here's the father of modern fine art glasswork, the guy who took glass out of the decorative only world and took it to the level of pure aesthetic experience. A guy named Dale Chihuly. He has a big glass studio in Seattle, Washington. If you ever watch the TV show called Frasier, if you look on Frasier's in the background on the shelving unit that he has in Frasier's apartment, he has a Dale Chihuly piece of glass sculpture, and that's a great example of how Frasier, the psychiatrist, the star of the show, is an affluent art collector. He has a Picasso painting as well in his living room, but he has a Dale Chihuly, and Dale Chihuly is a very popular Seattle, Washington sculptor and glass artist. Anyway, Chihuly brought glass to the spotlight of. He founded a place called the Pilchuck School of Glass in Washington State, and he has been a great teacher and supporter of experimental work in using glass for non-utilitarian reasons and to make it a kind of a purely aesthetic medium. Glass blowing in this case. This is a piece called Basket Set with oxblood lip wraps, and it's a big kind of bowl with little bowls inside it. In fact, it kind of is reminiscent. A lot of Dale Chihuly's work is reminiscent of kind of deep sea kind of creatures and kind of fire coral and sea anemones and jellyfish. This piece looks like kind of a mother jellyfish with baby jellyfish inside it to me, and this is something only possible to be presented through this wonderful white and semi-transparent glass with these red rims on them. It's very, very, very beautiful and very dreamlike in its kind of melty liquid imagery. Um, anyway, one thing for sure that Dale Chihuly's work demonstrates is the kind of frozen liquid state of glass. When you're working with glass, it's kind of like taffy, and you're shaping it and forming it and manipulating it. But when you're done, you can put it in the kiln. You can kind of freeze it in that kind of semi-melting moment, and there it is forever. The other great property of glass, of course, unlike any other medium except for perhaps plastic, is glass is transparent, and you can see through it. So it becomes kind of very magical in its visual presentation. Here's another Dale Chihuly piece, a much larger one. This piece is called Rotunda Chandelier, and it's 27 feet tall by 12 by 12 feet, so it's enormous. It's made of hundreds of these kind of glass, kind of spiraling horn shapes, all stuck together, hanging like a chandelier. And again, it doesn't look anything like my grandmother's chandelier, which was kind of very symmetrical and organized and had little glass crystals hanging from it. But rather, it looks like a real kind of almost a sea monster, kind of an explosion of serpent heads. 27 feet tall, it's enormous. And very fragile, of course. When these pieces are transported, they bring dozens and dozens of extra elements because some break each time they reassemble this complicated and very, very, very fragile glass object. Um, Fred Wilson is a contemporary artist who doesn't always work with glass. Sometimes an artist will be invited to work at an atelier or a studio which has master glass artists there. So Fred Wilson's made this piece called Drip, Drop, Plop, and it's made of glass, and it's obviously um, both on the wall and the floor. You see these kind of this black glass, and we see kind of teardrop shapes coming down the wall, or raindrops, and then on the bottom, what looks to be those same drops after they've hit the floor and become kind of circular blops or plops. So it's a drip, drop, plop. The drips being on the wall and the plops, I think, being on the floor. Um, it's a kind of a funny piece, inspired by Fred Wilson, is an African American artist, and in this piece he's talking about some black Africans who lived in Venice, in Italy, and are presented in Shakespeare's Othello, the Moor of Venice, and he's thinking about that history, but he's also thinking about 1930s cartoons, which sometimes showed stereotypical and derogatory images of African Americans. Kind of like in Dumbo, we have those two crows who are always talking in a kind of a stereotypical uh, kind of derogatory 1940s kind of urban way. He's kind of looking back at that, and he's giving these black raindrops eyes and kind of making them kind of cartoon characters, maybe reminiscent of some of that kind of racial, stereotypical, derogatory imagery. And then also, like all the artists in this chapter who use specific mediums, he's presenting, I think, a work of art that is only capable of existing in the specific medium, in glass. Glass can be shaped into these forms, and then again, I mentioned when we looked at the last piece by Dale Chihuly, you get this frozen liquid. It exists as this kind of very taffy-like kind of liquid, and then you can put it in the kiln and just freeze it as it was. So it's kind of a really unique and wonderful material. By using black glass, which kind of denies its transparency, but does show its fragility and brittleness, he's kind of perhaps referenced what he says is some of his ideas about black exploitation of the African American in the media throughout his. Here's a quote. I can read a quote. Here's a quote by Fred Wilson. Because of the 1930s cartoons that were recycled in my childhood in the 1960s, these cartoon eyes on the black objects represent African Americans in a very derogatory way. So I sort of view them as black tears. So he's presenting this kind of black tears, and then they hit the ground, and they kind of have a kind of a grin on them. So again, interesting idea of when one artist is invited into another facility. Fred Wilson is not primarily a glass artist, and we'll talk more about his other work in a moment. Here's Gregory Grenyon, and we call him a glass artist for the sake of this discussion, but really he's a painter who paints on glass. And in this case, on a very large piece, he's painting on plexiglass. Now, this photograph that we see in our textbook and on the screen now, this photograph doesn't really do the piece any justice because it might look a little unusual to you. But what the Grenyon does is he paints on the back side of a piece of glass, and then when he presents it to us, he turns it around. So we're seeing a clean piece of glass with a painted image on the back side of it, and this creates kind of a backlit effect. Not so different than kind of the glazing effect that you can get through fussy oil painting, because the image is kind of ghostly in its appearance, and it has kind of a depth and translucency to it. Anyway, in this case, he's not even painting on actual glass, but rather plexiglass, which is acrylic. It's still interesting to see other artists using glass in other ways. Back to Fred Wilson. Fred Wilson is an artist, and he's also a curator. He makes exhibitions. His most famous piece called "Mining the Museum," where he goes into a museum's holdings. When you go to a museum, you might see only 10 or 15% of what the museum owns. They'll have 85 or 90% of their collection in storage. Well, he goes into a museum and into their archives and into their storage, and he'll bring out works of art. And he'll kind of the word curator, to curate an exhibition, means to organize an exhibition, and the role of a curator is to build exhibitions that have some kind of cohesion. For example, you could curate an exhibition of portrait painting, of presidential portrait paintings. You would curate that show, and you would go and you would get paintings of the presidents of the United States, and you would curate that exhibition as such. Well, curators can have very specific goals, or they can kind of become artists in their own right. And more as we move through the beginning of the 21st century, the curator is becoming an artist in their own right. The curator and the way they present an exhibition starts to have aesthetic merit. So anyway, just suffice it to say that Fred Wilson goes through a museum, especially history museums. He'll go through their storage of objects and materials, and he'll present another story that perhaps is not popular in its depiction within the museum or within our culture. Here we see an inventory of the lists of slaves' names and their names and their description. Um, if you read carefully, you can see slaves at the top, and then it says one Negro woman, 73 years of age, $1. And then move down to the top line. It says one Negro boy, Daniel something, aged 18. And obviously an 18-year-old slave has more value than a 73-year-old slave in this marketplace. So, we live in a world where we're aware that the American history included slavery, and that's a very, very ugly and barbaric practice in our American history. But someone like Fred Wilson is an artist who insists on reminding us that this document exists. This document exists in the Maryland Historical Society Library, and when he curated an exhibition within this museum, he took out documents that the public, by and large, doesn't get to see every day, and he kind of, I wouldn't say rubbed our face in it, but he served to remind us of our very real history in an effort to, again, raise social consciousness. And by combining this piece with with period furniture from that time. He created these tableaus in these rooms, which forced the viewer to deal with kind of the sugar-coated version of our past, as well as the dark underbelly of it, which has things like slavery in them, which are obviously amongst the most barbaric components of human history, let alone such a recent part of American history. Here's additional elements that he had in his work of art, which again is made of what we call this found objects, in that he's reinstalled works of art from the museum. And you can see in the title card here it says Fred Wilson, artist slash curator, because he's not making the art so much as he's representing the art. In fact, by being allowed to have free reign over a museum's holdings, he's able to represent this complicated and profound situation. This this artist's work appears in the other three-dimensional media section of our textbook, although it could have appeared in other chapters, um, because he's often using works of art that have been made through the tradition of craft, as in the furniture making of the chairs, or the woodworking, or the metalworking of the tea sets, etc. But again, obviously this is not craft. This is provocative art designed to raise social consciousness and social awareness, and to make us aware of our history, so that we might learn from where we've been and make sure we don't go back to that place again. So here's some metal work from 1793 to 1880, which includes these beautiful silver teapots and water decanters and wine glasses and whatnot. And then, boom, right in the center, he's put down this other metal work, which we wouldn't normally see in this display case. He's included shackles used at the time to bind slaves. So you've got kind of the dichotomy here between these truly beautiful silver cast and fabricated um, pitchers and decanters and cups and goblets. And then in the middle of it, you've got to be reminded that the same metalsmiths who made these beautiful objects for rich people to enjoy a glass of tea with, those same metalsmiths also made shackles and monocles, shackles and handcuffs and whatnot, to bind and to imprison human beings who were bought and sold, as we saw in the earlier list. So you've got kind of the poignancy in his work that again, he's reminding us of our history in a way that makes it unescapable. And again, hopefully I've introduced the word curator to you. He is an artist and curator in that he's arranging an exhibition of someone else's artwork in a way that creates a provocative, and aesthetic, and perhaps socially aware thought. Now we move on to fiber. Um, Fiber arts. In the Middle Ages, tapestries such as this unicorn in captivity were used often to hang on the walls of an old castle. Again, before there were proper windows and proper insulation. If you lived in an old stone castle on a cold day, it could be pretty damp and cold in there. So they started hanging up tapestries on the walls. Well, if you were wealthy enough to have a wall hanging, you might be wealthy enough to have a decoration embroidered or sewn or woven into it. So here we see a 16th century wall hanging of silk and wool with silver and silver thread woven throughout it. This very, very beautiful fantasy image of a unicorn in a little caged-in fence. Kind of the metaphor here being catching the magical beast. And this is 12 by 8 feet. It's very large, and you would hang this on your wall. To be both beautiful, but from a utilitarian purpose, from a practical point of view, you would hang it there to keep the draft out, to keep you warmer in your room. All fiber arts, sculptural or not, trace their origins back to weaving, and weaving is the interlacing of horizontal threads, called the weft, and vertical threads, called the warp. So that's a very technical description, but all fiber arts come from weaving, and it's the weft, the horizontal threads, and the warp, the vertical threads, that come together to make fabric. And humans invented um, weaving because we needed clothing so we could stay warm and we could survive in the inhospitable climate of the world. Humans used to wear animal skins, and as we evolved as a culture, we started spinning fiber from wool, from sheep's fur, and from sheep's hair, and from cotton, and from linen, from flax that grew, different fibers, eventually creating a variety of fabric. Well, the idea of arranging fabric is all based in weaving, and in weaving again, the weft is the vertical threads, and the warp. I'm sorry, the the uh, the weft is horizontal threads, the warp is vertical threads, and when you weave them together, you get basic weaving, making fabric, which is what's used for tapestry. This is not a basic project. This is probably made for some royal family. This is a very beautiful and spectacular tapestry. So first we had tapestry within the fiber arts. Next, after tapestry, we have embroidery. This is the second traditional fiber art, and this is designed with a needle, and essentially it's drawing with thread and needle. Nowadays, you might go to a mall or a sporting goods store, and they might be able to have an embroidery machine which will sew your team's logo onto your jersey or your sports bag. But in the old days, it was done by hand, very slowly. And there's a town in India, where a town called Shamba, where this embroidery was really at its best. And this is an example of a rumal, R-U-M-A-L, a rumal, which is an embroidered textile, which would have a beautiful narrative and decorative situation on top of it. You see all kinds of elephants and animals and people and whatnot. This is all done through embroidery. 1926, we move to the 20th century, and here we see Annie Albers designed this piece called the wall hanging, and it really reflects 1926. Now we're kind of between World War I and World War II, and you've got a different kind of design phenomenon going on in the world. And this piece has a very kind of a early modern kind of sense of pattern and design. But again, this is dyed silk. Um, Cotton, another piece of design. I think the author shows us these in this chapter again as we come to terms with how much like contemporary painting a lot of tapestry, weaving, and fiber arts can be, to show that the fiber artist is really working kind of alongside contemporary painters. This piece is from 1950s, and it starts to even look like a Bridget Riley painting, which we saw earlier from the same time period. And there's a real parallel between what's happening on the artist's canvas with a paintbrush and paints, or on the artist's fiber projects and efforts. A real kind of a parallel between what happened within the medium of paint and the medium of fiber arts. 1988, Faith Ringgold made this piece, a wonderful fantasy piece called Tar Beach. Tar Beach is an expression that this is and I know my New York geography pretty well, so that's a rooftop looking at the George Washington Bridge, probably from either Washington Heights or from somewhere in the greater Harlem on the west side of uptown Manhattan. And you could see a little tiny person floating in the sky. That's the same little girl who's laying down on the mattress on the rooftop. Tar beach refers to the tar on top of your roof. If you live in a high-rise building in New York City and you didn't have air conditioning on a hot summer day, you would eat dinner on your rooftop and you would sleep on your rooftop to keep cool. So it's called, you go to the sandy beach. Well, this is tar beach because it's not nearly as beautiful, but it is all yours, and you might even have some plants up there and dry your laundry. But you might have, nowadays people put fancy wooden planks down and make it a rooftop deck, they call it. But in the old days, they just called it tar beach. And here, Faith Ringgold is referring back to her childhood and making this kind of a quilted assemblage that's made of, again, of painted up paint. She's painting on fabric, and she's got this wonderful surreal image where you see, again, the little girl who's sitting on the mattress with her maybe brother, little brother, is dreaming about floating up above the George Washington Bridge and up in the stars. So it's kind of a wonderful uh, slice of autobiography where this artist is showing you kind of her childhood and this phenomenon which you might not all be aware of if you weren't an urbanite who lived in crowded New York City, um, but also the family having dinner and what the choices for dinner were, and she's using some of the rules of perspective and deep space and whatnot to make this kind of very fanciful piece, which also, again, if you look around the perimeter, is a tapestry. It's a quilt, in fact. You see all the little squares that have been sewn together. Some parts have been painted on to express this kind of wonderful fantasy piece of Faith Reingold's apartment building roof where she would sleep on a hot summer night when she was growing up. Mike Kelly is another artist who works with fiber. This piece is called "More Love Hours Than Can Ever Be Repaid," and that's a pretty provocative and peculiar title. And I think what Michael Kelly's talking about here is, um, when you're a little kid, you might have a stuffed animal that you love, and you sleep with it in your room, or you keep it on your shelf in your bedroom, and it's something that's important to you, whether it's Raggedy Ann or one of these silly alligators. He mostly picks kind of hand crocheted, kind of something that's made by like your grandma rather than something store bought. You don't see any store bought animals on here because Mike Kelly's more interested in the ones that were made as a gift from one person to another, kind of like grandma makes it for their grandchild and say, "Here, honey, here's a little doll I made you." So there's even more love involved. Grandma loves the granddaughter. She makes her a little dolly. The dolly loves the little doll. Well, what Michael Kelly does is he goes to thrift stores and he buys these out of the garbage bin after they've been discarded. So he's trying to talk about the fact that all that love has been abandoned and all that care has been abandoned and kind of thrown away. He's even hung it up with these kind of ears of dried corn, and he's trying to make a reference, I think, to Native Americans, the Indian culture that we all live with, and how we've kind of thrown away our Native American cultural experience. We've sacrificed, the West has sacrificed, the European culture has sacrificed the Native American culture in our life, the same way these dolls have been kind of thrown away by the dominant culture. Anyway, Michael Kelly is not happy with modern society, and he's got a lot of criticism to make for it. This is one work of art where he expresses his kind of anger and disapproval of modern society by showing us this pile of objects that have been rejected by the original owners and put into the trash bin, apparently without a hint of remorse. I mean, this idea that someone made these as a term of endearment for someone they loved, and that person kept them for a while. But what happened? Why did we stop loving these things? Well, how did they wind up in the garbage? And he's just trying to present them again as more love hours than can ever be repaid. In other words, these animals were these little toys were there for children to hug and keep them comfortable when they're laying in bed, and now they've grown up and become hardened American consumers, and they've abandoned them, and he's kind of pulled them out of the stockpiles of thrift stores and presented them for us to kind of deal with. So again, the tradition of fiber arts is the medium, but I think clearly there's a provocative message being presented by the artist. Magdalena Abakanowicz is an artist who's brought fiber arts, um, like Dale Chihuly did with glass. She's brought fiber arts out of um, being just straightforward tapestries and weavings and made them very sculptural. She's taken them to another place. Here we see a installation photograph of 80 sculptures made out of burlap and resin that look like a congregation of people kind of praying together, or somehow in some kind of ritual gathered together out in the landscape. And this is a typical Magdalena Abakanowicz piece where you see fiber arts being freed from any utilitarian association and being used more boldly just as material. No restriction in them being for tapestries to hang on our wall and to keep the draft out. We've gone from an ancient unicorn tapestry to this kind of bizarre sculptural piece, but they're all made out of fabric, and that's an exciting kind of transformation. Here's one more, our final piece in the the world of the subject of fiber arts and tapestry, fabric, made by Yinka Shonibari, and it's called a Victorian Couple. And this is absolutely hybrid clothing, and it's pretty complicated. What she's done here is she's taken a traditional Victorian dress and she's made them or remade them out of traditional African patterns. So she's kind of colliding African patterns, fabric patterns, with Victorian dress, and made these kind of wonderful and very hip and cool kind of look like costumes. Um, so now, what about that? Well, it's not that simple. She's not simply taking A plus B. Um, it gets even more confusing and complicated. What the Yinka is doing is she's taking the colorful prints and fabrics that are worn throughout Western Africa, and yes, she's turning them into a Victorian traditional um, costume for the rich and wealthy, white Europeans. But what's remarkable is she's flipping it on its head, because in fact in the modern world, um, these fabrics are manufactured in Europe, but then exported to Africa, where they are then remarketed to the West, to you and I, if we go to an African design shop and and try to get some kind of cool uh, step in style kind of shirt and pants ensemble. So she's taking kind of this hybridization of the African and the European designs, and she's reminding us that even that has collapsed upon itself and been inverted and twisted, and that in fact, these are export-only pattern. They're not even export-only. They're made by, Westerners in Western shops to emulate African design, but they're not, this precise national dress code. And as an African woman living in England, or I guess you call her. They don't call her. If you're black and you live in Africa, you're not African British. You're just British, but you're of African descent, I think is how they would say it. Anyway, she's playing with all the complexities of colonialization and international trade and whatnot, and making these, in the end, these very beautiful, very fantastic kind of dresses and suits, which deal with the complexity of global civilization and international society. Now we move on to metal. The Griffin bracelet is almost 3,000 years old, and this is, again, metal is perhaps one of the most durable of all the craft media, metal, which is why it has been used for food and drinking vessels, tools, jewelry, and certainly for weapons over all of human civilization. Over the years, silver and gold have been the most lavishly used for the creation of jewelry, and this Persian Griffin bracelet is thought to be one of the most beautiful works of jewelry ever made. It was originally inlaid with colored stones, and some of the finest works have been commissioned, of course, by royal families. They have all the money and all the power. In the 16th century, in 1539, Benvenuto Cellini created this exquisite salt cellar for Francis I, the King of France. It's made of gold and enamel, and it's actually a very fancy and functional salt and pepper shaker. The male figure of Neptune represents the sea, hence salt, sea salt, and the female figure represents the earth, which is the origin of peppers, where they grow in the earth. So you've got this really beautiful 10-inch tall solid gold salt and pepper shaker. Pretty nice metalsmith, um, made by Benvenuto Cellini. So it's pretty cool. Here's a more contemporary 1991 bit of metalsmithing, and here we see a teapot. This is a very dynamic and exciting teapot, which I don't think you or I would have at home on our stove, a tea kettle, but you could see how it has a lid that fills that hole, and you could boil water in it, and nothing else. This shows us that design and craft design has evolved and continues to evolve from that 400-year-old salt and pepper shaker to this really equally fascinating silver and gold teapot made just a few years ago. We spoke about metal, and now we'll briefly speak about wood. Wood, because it's easy to carve and widely available wherever you have trees, has always been a popular material for artisans and artists and craftsmen in all civilizations. However, unlike metal, wood is not long lasting. In fact, very few artifacts survive from the ancient culture made of wood. That's because of fires, termites, and whatnot. Cedar is a kind of wood that works beyond this limitation. Cedar is a wood native to northwestern American coast, and it's a favorite wood of Native American artists in that region. Cedar is resistant naturally to insects and to weather. This chest we see here is an example of a kind of a decorative chest that served as both a container for this clan's heirlooms and also as a bench or throne for the clan leader during family and clan discussions. So this is from the Heltsuk tribe, and we would have called this something you would see in the Inuit world. Inuit world, we would call. I think we incorrectly called them Eskimo people in the past. Now we call them Inuits or Native Americans, people who lived in the northwest coast of America since for thousands and thousands of years before the Westerners showed up. Anyway, here's a beautiful cedar carved chest. Cedar is a naturally insect and weather resistant wood, the same way in New Orleans we used cypress because it grows in the swamps and the termites don't like it, and it's a hardy wood. Um, Artists and architects don't just design sculptures and buildings, they also design furniture. Antoni Gaudi made this chair. He used to design buildings and also design the furniture which would go in the buildings. He's the famous Spanish architect Antoni Gaudi, who was famous for creating curved and very organic architectural designs. He felt that the furniture in his environments should match the building and the room themselves, and here he's trying to replicate the organic curves and lines of this famous building called the Casa Calvé in Barcelona. And it's, again, 1904. This chair is over 100 years old, but still has a dynamic and wonderfully contemporary feel. Looks very, very modern. Our final work of wood in this chapter is by an artist named Martin Puryear. He considers himself to be an artist, not a craftsman, although he is an excellent craftsman. And this piece is called Ladder for Booker T. Washington. Um, the photograph you're looking at shows you, this is a photograph taken in Dallas, Texas, and it shows us, I'm sorry, it's in Fort Worth, next to Dallas, at the Museum of Modern Art. The photograph's a little bit misleading because it looks like it's a very, 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 very tall room. Well, that's a little bit of distortion. Martin Puryear has made this ladder get narrow as it gets higher, so it's kind of a distorted perspective, which was intentional to Martin Puryear's intention. There's a quote in your textbook I'll read by the artist Martin Puryear about the sculpture Ladder for Booker T. Washington. The artist says, quote, "The work was really about using the sapling, using the tree," Puryear explains, "and making a work that has a kind of artificial perspective, a forced perspective, an exaggerated perspective that made it look to recede into space faster than it does in fact." And that's what he's done here. He's taken this actual piece of an ash tree, this long branch of an ash tree, and he split it down the middle, making this ladder with these beautiful mortise joints and this very careful and attentive skill. And he's made this ladder that kind of goes and kind of undulates and curves as it moves along. He called it a ladder for Booker T. Washington, and he's trying to talk about the subject, Booker T. Washington, and Booker T. Washington, who of course is the African American political leader and educator who, at the turn of the century, worked to improve racial harmony in America. And Booker T. Washington saw the process as long and slow, and a process whose end was always seeming very far away. So Puryear has made this ladder perhaps to explain this point of view, that the goal of Booker T. Washington might be nearer than he thought because the room's only about 20 feet tall, but to show us this kind of long struggle and climb to find racial harmony and racial understanding in our nation. So again, woodworking presented in this kind of high craft, but also I think highly provocative and interesting manner, which I don't know if it helps settle the argument of what's the difference between art and craft, because this piece is very much full of the skill of the craftsman, but also very much full of the poetic and aesthetic richness of the artist. So you really have both happening here at once. I don't think we've clarified the difference, but maybe we've clarified how they both work together and how the argument is really meaningless. So this concludes our lecture 15 on the other three-dimensional media. I'm just going to go through the list here to make sure I didn't miss any of the terms. Craft, we talked about the division between craft and fine art and how they are the same and how they're different. We spoke about ceramics and how clay is fired in a kiln to make earthenware, stoneware, or porcelain. We spoke about slab construction, coiling, and throwing as three ways that clay can be manipulated into a vessel, the potter's wheel being used for throwing. Glazing is used in earthenware to make it waterproof, although it can also be used in stoneware and porcelain. We spoke about glass blowing and looked at Dale Chihuly and some other glass artists' work. Then we spoke about metal. We saw the Cellini salt cellar and some other artists who work with metal. Wood, we saw lots of wooden objects, the ladder for Booker T. Washington being the most recent by Martin Perrier. Weaving, we learned about the weft and the warp, the horizontal and vertical threads which go into making fabric. Tapestry and embroidery being two of those techniques. And then a name that's not on the list is the curator. We spoke about the curator and specifically Fred Wilson and how he would present art that was not his in a way that had, I think, very provocative aesthetic value. So this concludes lecture 15 on the other three-dimensional media. Thanks.